It's a great pleasure to see you all. I'm Hugo Slim, and I'm Head of Policy at the ICRC. And it's a great pleasure for me this evening to host this event by the Humanitarian Policy Group from London with our representative from there, Eva. And we are here in the Humanitarian, but we are also here online. We have about 500 people registered and watching online, so big welcome to them. And also to say that if you want to do questions from the online position, please do tweet them to the hashtag Humanitarian Access. And then we can, I've got a thing here, it's my first time I've done this, where I have to find your questions later. So we'll take some questions both from the audience later and from the online audience as well. We've got a wonderful panel here this evening who are going to discuss our theme, which is humanitarian access in armed conflicts, the key role of local actors. And we have, first of all, Eva from Humanitarian Policy Group, who's been leading a lot of research on this issue from London and Geneva. And we have all the bios on your chair, so you can see more detail. And then Lars Peter from ACAPS here in Geneva, and Claudia from Berlin, from GPPI in Berlin. And then on this side, Marina from Ukraine, from Responsible Citizens, which is an NGO in Ukraine that you founded. And Iyat as well from Turkey at the moment, working with an organization called Watan, which is supporting people in Syria as well. So we have a great mix and a great panel and a great audience here and online, so thank you for coming. I just want to address briefly our topic. So we are discussing tonight humanitarian access in armed conflict, the key role of local actors. And there are two key words in that title, both of which are extremely relevant to global humanitarian policy at the moment. And one, of course, is access, and the other is local. So this discussion this evening on the panel and with you all is to bring those two together, access and localization. And if we think of access for a moment, access, of course, has been a key part of humanitarian action for as long as humanitarian action has existed, the need to be close to people in need. And there are really two aspects to access. And the first, of course, is that people, affected populations, vulnerable people, people in need access to basic services and assistance and protection. So we have to think of access as people's access to basic services, assistance and protection. And then the other aspect, of course, is humanitarian actors, humanitarian agency access to people. So in an ideal world, those two things come together, and that's what we need to discuss this evening. And in particular, talking about local actors this evening, we are therefore exploring how local actors play a role in access, and whether they have strengths and weaknesses in achieving and enabling people's access to services and protection and assistance, whether they have advantages, disadvantages. So that's what we want to talk about, bringing localization and access together. And the format is quite simple. I will have a conversation up here. We'll start a conversation with each of our panelists, and we'll talk to each one of them in turn, looking at a different aspect. And we'll do that for about 50 minutes, and then I'll come to you, and we'll have a Q&A first with people here in Geneva, and then we'll take questions from the online audience. So, welcome to our panel again, and it's a great pleasure to have you all here. I'm going to start with Lars Peter from ACAPS, who gathers all sorts of data and information on humanitarian operations globally and the context in which they work. And Lars Peter, we've got a slide of yours we're going to look at, I hope. Do we have a slide? The ACAPS slide. Here we are, which gives a broad global picture of access levels, access issues at the moment around the world in key humanitarian contexts. It'd be very interesting if you could just take a bit of time to tell us the method, how you arrive at data around access, and then how you see major constraints to access at the moment and major trends that are emerging.
Thank you. So maybe just a couple of words on our general work for you to understand how it fits into the global access map. In ACAPS, we have a team of analysts who on a weekly basis scan between 40 and 45 contexts and produce what we call a global severity ranking. So we essentially compare crises across the globe according to a number of different dimensions. That's primarily done on secondary data that we find available from public sources, combined with the network we have in the humanitarian sector, so collaboration with humanitarian agencies. This map, it's the first time we have put it out, and it's one of the layers in our overall ranking. So we look at 3 to 6 months ahead of time, what are the main risks facing us, and then also we produce this map on humanitarian access. And I will try to speak a bit around what's the concept we use in terms of access, how do we understand that, and some of the strengths and weaknesses of a map like this. What does it do for us, and equally important, what doesn't it do for us? Right? So firstly, the concept we use is very much along the lines of what you mentioned, Hugo. We have 3 dimensions. One is it possible for affected populations to access humanitarian aid? Secondly, is it possible for humanitarians to access affected population? And then thirdly, a dimension around physical and security constraints, so factors in the environment that are not specifically targeted at stopping access to or from humanitarian aid, but still constrained. For example, we also use it for natural disasters. So for example, right after a natural disaster, there will be a number of physical constraints in the environment, which has nothing to do with security, but infrastructure, and they also constrain us from a humanitarian point of view. Right. Just to give you a couple of examples on the sort of indicators we use, it's bureaucratic administrative impediments to get into the country, restriction of movement, interference in implementation of humanitarian action, violence against personnel, facilities, and assets. That's sort of the first dimension of access of humanitarians. Secondly, people in need, their access to aid is around the denial of existence of humanitarian aid, so exclusion from the humanitarian narrative, if you want, of certain groups or populations. And then it's restriction and obstruction of access to services and assistance. And the final one is around ongoing security hostility. It can be mines, UXOs, or it can be damages to physical infrastructure.
And what is the map telling us? Where are we today?
Well, it's pretty red. It's the first thing you notice, right? And I think that there are 2 things. One, humanitarian access is a major problem across the globe. That is clear. The dark red is the most restricted. It also tells you that we use quite a low resolution, right? You see 3 categories, basically. The orange, the yellow, and the red. And the reason we do that is to ensure that we are not precisely wrong, right? I think one of the big dangers when you try to pull off something like this and provide that global overview is that you pretend to have a precision you don't, right? So what we can do here is to say, roughly speaking, this is the pattern we see. And obviously you see some clusters of red areas where I think to most humanitarians it's well known that we have big problems. But you also see, for example, Central America with other situations of violence popping up, right? And I think one of the advantages here is that maybe some of the situations that we don't typically think of as humanitarian, we're able to rank and it can serve as a reminder of not just developing tunnel vision of some of the most severe crises that we of course spend most of our energy on.
And what trends are we seeing in this global map? Are we seeing certain kinds of your indicators like bureaucratic obstacles or infrastructure obstacles or security going up, others down, or are they fairly... What trends are you observing?
First of all, it's the first map we put out. Mm-hmm. So in terms of trends, it's limited what we can say from this perspective. I think the severe crises tend to be bad all over, across the board, right? So it's not a question of it's both a question of restraining to and from access, you would say. And then you can see what this map would have, had we done trends, some of the things you would have seen would have been Kenya spiking into red at the election time, for example. It would be Myanmar deteriorating. Right? So some of those traffic lights pop up here and there. That's what you can use a map like this from.
And what are you going to do with this in future? So you're going to publish this now, is it quarterly, 6 months?
This will be published on a quarterly basis. We could probably publish it more frequently, but I don't think you would see interesting trends if you do it too quickly. There needs to be a certain interval, and we think 3 months is probably about right.
That's brilliant.
Yeah?
Is it falling off me? Is it the microphone? Good. Lars Peter, thank you very much.
Maybe just one last point that we So my personal opinion on this one, the biggest problem we have is that it shows you access at country level, not at crisis level, right? There's zones in Central America, there are parts of Ukraine where access is a big problem, others no. And we don't capture that, right? And that's one of the things we want to work on, a move from country level analysis to crisis level analysis. The Philippines, Mindanao, so on.
Good, so really break it down, make it more granular as you go.
Yeah.
Good, Lars Peter, thanks. Ava, I'm going to move to you now. You've spent time doing quite deep research with local organizations, looking on the ground at how they work, how they achieve or do not achieve access, how people can reach their services or not. What have you found, going into, as Lars Peter was saying, going into country level? What are you finding?
So perhaps to start out with, I would argue that access challenges for humanitarian organizations are neither new nor fundamentally different today than from what they were in the past. I think what has changed over the past 30 years, so since the end of the Cold War, is that aid organizations are present in conflicts rather than at the periphery, which means they are exposed to levels of insecurity and risk. And as a result, there has been a lot of research. You've done a lot of research, other organizations, think tanks, on humanitarian access challenges and how this can be improved. But it is focused mostly on what we call the formal humanitarian sector, so UN agencies, the ICRC, INGOs. But it hasn't really looked at local organizations, and that's what we've tried to do. So we looked at Ukraine and Syria, local organizations, not just humanitarian, other organizations, peace, mediation as well, development organizations. And ultimately what we found that all organizations, regardless of where they come from, face similar challenges, and they try to address them in similar ways. So whether they're international or local, the challenges are pretty much the same. What are they? You already alluded to some of them. Levels of insecurity, so lack of respect for international humanitarian law, human rights law, bureaucratic impediments, armed actors or states, belligerents being unwilling or reluctant to grant access, counterterrorism legislation. But what we also found is that local organizations, they have a number of advantages. And they chiefly are that they're flexible, they're agile, they're able to react very quickly, they have local knowledge and proximity, what you just mentioned. So the presence within the communities. Quite often, these organizations or the individuals who work for them come from the very same communities they're trying to assist. But what we also found is that having personal ties, what does that mean, personal ties? Is it family? Is it kinship? Is it ideology? Is it religion? So it varies quite a bit. We found in the case of Syria that Palestinian organizations have been able to operate on, in fact, both sides, so government-held areas as well as opposition-held areas, not because of their personal ties, but because of their identity. In Ukraine, a lot of organizations work with a very low visibility approach, so they try to operate below the radar, not to attract too much attention from the de facto authorities. And they're only able to do that because they've got trusted networks. So they choose the profile of their volunteers. For example, those who cross checkpoints, mostly female volunteers, they attract less attention, seem to be less threatening, rather than male volunteers. The local knowledge also helps them to tailor the message to the particular armed group that operates in an area. So is the messaging more religiously kind of colored, or is it more ideological? So they understand that context and know how to tailor particular messages. What is also important, of course, is community acceptance, and that's the same for international organizations as it is for local organizations. This community acceptance is largely based on, again, their presence. Local organizations are often seen as being perhaps more accountable to communities. They stay while international organizations often leave due to security risks. Again, in the case of Ukraine, we found examples where some organizations actually cross minefields to avoid checkpoints. So they have a higher threshold of risk appetite. But we need to be careful when we say local organizations have better access. I think it's a bit too simplistic. local does not automatically translate into better access. It's true that those local contacts help in negotiating access in the first place, but also local organizations need to earn that access. They have to be able to provide assistance that is timely, that is relevant, that is adequate. Without it, they lose access. So in a way, when we spoke to local organizations, whether that's in Ukraine or Syria, they said, access isn't limitless. We need to earn it. We need to negotiate it all the time. And so perhaps just to say, you spoke about the disadvantages or some of the challenges that they face. Yes, they are agile, they're small, they're flexible, but they're not always able to operate in all areas. So they operate where their network is best, where their network is strongest. They also sometimes struggle, if I just may finish, they have a limited ability to scale up. And in both contexts, especially at the beginning, most of these local organizations were volunteer-based. They relied on individual donations. And of course, as conflicts drag on, it's a lot more difficult to sustain that. And also, they had to make compromises. So sometimes they were aligned with a particular group. And of course, that can have consequences. Ultimately, perhaps to close, what perhaps I'd like to impress on is, as the localization agenda moves forward, and you mentioned it, not just since the WHS, but it's swiftly moving forward, that we question these labels. So ultimately, for our research, if we say, this is a local organization, this is an international organization, it wasn't very helpful to look at the issues. The issues remained the same. What we need to do is find out and honestly question who's the best place to respond in a particular organization that might be a local organization, that might be an international one, and what kind of support does each one need to respond to needs.
That's very helpful. So the research is showing that performance is key, relationships are key, that local organizations can have advantages there, but scale is an issue. Scaling up and achieving scale is an issue. Because I'm from the ICRC, of course, you'd expect me to ask you, do principles play a part? You talked about local organizations being able and ready to compromise, to often be positioned in the conflict itself. Do principles play a part in the advantage or disadvantage of local organizations?
So what we found is that initially the principles weren't very well known amongst local organizations. But they have become more known. They often use them now. They train in humanitarian principles. I mean, I think I would have to say that the challenges to adhering to humanitarian principles are the same for international organizations as for local organizations. I mean, name an international organization that doesn't ever compromise. And so I think what it needs is an honest discussion about what these compromises are. Where do we draw the red line? What can we agree upon, and what do we reject? So yes, humanitarian principles are perhaps of less importance, but they're certainly now, after 5 years in Syria and a number of years also in Ukraine, they are better known. But yes, there are always compromises. And perhaps an interesting thing, international organizations told us that, well, we know what they can do, these compromises. We've been in Iraq, we've been in Afghanistan, and we now see the consequences of some of these compromises we've made. And I think that's an interesting discussion to have. But it shouldn't be used as a yardstick to say a local organization is credible only if it adheres to humanitarian principles.
Eva, thank you. And I would urge you all to read the research. There are two reports outside. One is Eva's general report on Syria, and one is on Ukraine. So please do take copies on your way out and read in more detail. But thank you for that summary. I want to move to IAD now, and now we're moving to the local actors, the local NGO side of the table. IAD, I want to ask you, Eva has talked about strategies. What sort of strategies do you use as a relatively small local actor in negotiating access, achieving access, enabling people to reach your services? What kind of strategies?
Well, Hugo, basically, I think.
Are you on?
I'm on now?
That's good. That's very good. Yeah.
Well, basically, as Eva mentioned, there's a few things that is taken for granted. Like, for example, local means a better access, which is not the case. Basically, first, we have to focus on tactics rather than strategy. So basically being able to move quickly, being able to use different tactics, different plans, different preparation in order for us to gain that access. So, but there's a few things that is more of strength to the local organization that we do use. First of all is the access to the local communities, and in which it doesn't mean that, relatively speaking, we do have access to a certain type of communities, but rather than explaining the mandate of each organization, whether it was humanitarian development, and putting it in a model that is accepted for the community itself. This is number one strength that we're able to do, building up the reputation for those organizations that works in answering the real needs of the people. So this is another point that we work very hard to achieve, and to be very assertive about answering the needs of the local communities.
I just pick you up there, yeah, because when you say the community, we're trying to, make ourselves clear to the community. What do you mean? Are you talking about getting the acceptance, literally, of people in the community, or are you talking also about organized groups like local councils and other kind of authorities that you're dealing with?
Again, basically, this is, if you asked me this question 2 years ago, I'd say that we're focusing more mainly on the local councils, but now it's not the case. It's local councils, it's a community-based organization, it's community leaders, whether they're religious leader or whatever leaders there is. So basically, we need to be close and very agile to know what type of changes happening in the community-based level. Basically, second point of strategy that we do use is being able to move quickly. And in that is basically building the capacity of the community-based teams and the network inside the community as well. So as a very good example of that is, and using untraditional channels as well. So basically a very good example of that is when Aleppo was under siege. There was a lot of discussion on UN level talking on how can we, get the access to Aleppo, deliver the aid in a timely manner. Unfortunately, the formal traditional channels failed to do so. But at the same time, there are some untraditional channels that opened up, and a lot of local organizations were able to get some aid in there. But unfortunately, again, lack of funds didn't allow those organizations to get the proper need in time, which was really frustrating to witness that, because we do not have the access, but we lack the fund and lack the ability, lack the aid to produce, to give to the people. Basically, last point of things that local resort to is basically coordination and cooperation between themselves and between other stakeholders and actors, such as INGOs, UN agencies, and whatnot. And another example of that is through one of the projects that we do have, we have something called the Rapid Response Network, which is not a network, rather than a mechanism we use to address the emergency that's happening, especially the movement of people, the IDPs. So basically that network consists of different local actors, community-based organizations, ourselves, and different INGOs and UN agencies as well, in which key factor is being prepared, knowing everything was everyone's capacity to address, the emerging needs, and basically to put the mechanism in place. But unfortunately, again, due to the useful of the using of the tactical way, it's only valid when the project is valid. But then again, when the project runs out of fund, it fails apart.
And of those big indicators that Lars Peter mentioned, sort of bureaucratic obstacles, hardcore security threats, infrastructure challenges of logistics and things, where are your big challenges? Are you flashing red on each of them, or are you orange on some and red on others?
Well, basically, bureaucratical challenges is number one, because basically this is the one thing that is stopping us from moving forward, because we do have, like, for example, infrastructure or whatnot, we can use whatever available. But those things really stop us because it's really stopped the way of getting to the aid itself. So basically, this is number one.
And can I just pick up? Eva made a very interesting point that in a sense, whether you're talking international or local, when it comes to access, it's quite a level field. Everybody has problems. Do you need international actors?
Well, basically, as local has a certain advantages in, getting the access, the physical access, let's say. But the international partners, and NGOs have different advantages, in which they do have the capacity to reach the funds, So basically, this is number one. So they do have better access to the funds because local actors doesn't have a good track record. Basically, most of them were emerged in 2012, 2011,
Any other advantages?
Well, basically, this is number one advantage, and the organizational capacities, in which basically in here as like a better, if we are really moving to localization, we need to enhance the partnership between those organizations.
How do we do that?
Currently, unfortunately, like most of those organizations or most of these partnerships are more like contractual relationship rather than an actual partnership in which really both partners invest in each other and building the organizational capacity of the local organization, getting, a win-win situation, which the WHS try to, push forward. We try to as well in Syria context, but then again, it doesn't always have the real actors believes into pushing that agenda forward.
And what is the biggest anxiety you find on the part of international actors?
Well, basically, international partners have different regulatory environment to respond to, and basically when that changes, sometimes their commitment to local partners changes as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very clear. I think we're getting quite a good picture so far. I just want to move to you now, Marina, but before I do, I want to remind those listening online and watching online, please do send in questions. And also to remind you all that this will be a video of this conference, hopefully with the bit about my microphone edited out, will be available probably midweek this week on the ICRC forum website, so you'll see it then. Marina, what's the story in Ukraine? What are the challenges? How does this conversation sound to you? I mean, you're someone who comes, if you read Marina's bio, you'll see she's got extraordinary depth of experience actually in government work and everything. You've moved over, you've founded a small local organization. What are the challenges? What are the difficulties?
The main difficult was to make a choice, because when the hottest phase of the war at May or 12-14 started, the majority of the regional elite escaped. So you have to make the decision who is going to stay and who is going to provide any humanitarian assistance and to whom. And if you lived and if you worked in this region, definitely you know people, you try to coordinate as soon as possible the group of volunteers in order to help to ordinary people. For us, as responsible citizens, the critical issue and the critical principle was we are not working or assisting with armed people. We're focused only for civilians, and we are working only with the civilians. At this stage, we have to differentiate in the Ukrainian conflict. Responsible citizens were the people who opened the door to ICRC, UN, and other international organizations. And on your question, what is the perfect consensus or the perfect and effective partnership, I would say the following. Local people with a good network, as you said, they should open up the door and help to clean up the roads for the international, sustainable and big institutions. On the last one, they have to be a bit more flexible and less bureaucratic. But during the hottest phase of the war, since 2014 up to 2016, we were at the territory, on the fields, and we were assisting to the major partners
And can you give a concrete example of that,
For instance,
of that cooperation, that synergy?
Synergy. At the very beginning, you understand that it is chaos. For instance, when our lovely partners and one of the real partner, Doctors Without Borders and ICRC, they did not have even an office, but they have to start from something. And there is the team on the ground, and you start to help them finding an office, finding a place, or according to some protocol, they cannot deliver some real help to the front line because it's shelling. And for us being local, and we live under the shelling, and we live in the circumstance when the heavy weapons are working almost every day, we get used to that. So we can easily take the necessary medicine or the necessary assistance and brought to those settlements where are not in the protocol of safety.
And how many organizations like yours sprung up spontaneously in Ukraine and in Donetsk and places?
At the very beginning, there were a lot, but we survived together with the Akhmetov's foundation, and from the very beginning till the 2016, there were only two organizations, Responsible Citizens and Akhmetov organization, which are Ukrainian organization operating on a non-controlled territory. After 2016, the de facto authorities made a decision that only international organizations like UN, ICRC are going to work there, and ECHO. And if we look at the landscape now, we will see ICRC, UN, ECHO, and the Russian humanitarian support.
So that large body of spontaneous citizens' humanitarian action has shrunk?
It's shrunk because the needs became different, that's the first. And because responsible citizens were operating on both sides, we have to be impartial all the time, and we have to be in dialogue with everybody.
And how do you do that?
How do you do normally that? If I will tell you about my experience, all right? I just focus on the human beings who never took an arm or they do not use weapons. And for me, that's my target group. And for those people, I will do whatever I need, and I will risk even my life. For those people who took or who aren't, and they understand how to kill, so that's probably not the group of people I would prefer to talk. But I have to be polite with them and impartial in order to deliver assistance to those who are living on the front line.
So how do you explain your resilience in this context when many others have either proved inappropriate or pushed out?
Say it again, I didn't understand.
How do you explain your resilience as a local actor? The fact that you have kept going, that you have survived one of two local actors who for many months remained on...
First of all, we were very quiet, below radar. We all of us were local, and frankly speaking, the majority of the people do know each other, and if you had in the past position in the local government, people do know you, and they accept two things, that you stayed, and probably they might respect the fact that you not just stayed, but you are doing something for civilians.
So performance again.
Performance, deliverables, those are visible facts, but in a silence environment. Don't talk how brave you are, don't talk how much you did, just do the job. And to be fair, when the heavy weapons and are working, you have a lot of time to talk. Your purpose is just to take children to the shelter, or very quickly to transport wounded children to the hospital. And
well, it's fascinating. I mean, I'm sure people will come and talk to you both more. I mean, you were a senior person in government, you were working for Nestle, and now you are both running local organizations, and I think that's extraordinary. So let's talk to them further. Thank you both. Claudia, I want to come to you now, and in GPBI you were part of a very important research project called SAVE, which I think was Safe Access in Volatile Environments. And you looked very carefully for many months at different organizations and access. What were the big things you discovered going back to the big picture across the globe?
Well, let me first start on where we actually started with this research, because it's really nice to see also that others are now starting to look at the nuances of what access means and what access means to different actors. Because we basically started back in 2013, and when I say we, I mean GPPI together with Humanitarian Outcomes. And we were a bit struck by the fact that there was so little data on what was actually happening in those very, very insecure contexts. So MSF was famously asking, where is everyone? And then at the same time and in the same context, you had humanitarian coordination bodies claiming that there's 600, 700 national NGOs working. So we really wanted to understand a little bit better this very basic question of who is actually out there and who is actually doing the work. So we managed to get funding actually from DFID's Research and Evidence Division to do a 3-year research project focusing on 4 countries that are usually the most risky for humanitarian aid workers. We looked at Afghanistan, we looked at Syria, we looked at South Sudan, and we looked at Somalia. And we studied a few sub-points of this question of access. First of all, we didn't look at access as in the hindering factors, but we looked at coverage. So we wanted to know who is actually where the needs are highest. Then once we had this question settled with a lot of data that we had inputted in our system, I'm not going to get into the methods of that in order not to bore you. But then we went on to actually ask those few actually organizations who have access, why do they have access? And what kinds of compromises may they make? How do they uphold a principled approach under the very difficult circumstances that they're operating in? And something else we did is that we worked with 18 NGOs to actually also ask them, what kind of things do you want to know, and what kind of applied research could we provide to make your work a little bit simpler? This study didn't focus on national organizations per se, but there's a couple of findings that I in preparation for this and also now listening to you, I would like to highlight. The first one relates to the question of coverage and the biases we found in terms of coverage. First of all, one important finding was that international organizations tend to cluster in areas where insecurity is not that high in these kinds of contexts. So already we have a very small group of international organizations together with national organizations that are at the front line and where the needs are greatest. So that's a first bias that we found. But then a very important second bias we found is that there was actually the coverage of needs was better in government-controlled areas. And that's where it becomes important for national actors, because one of the things that struck us as well in the study is that national actors still get a lot of the funding through the international system. And you both alluded to that you can work where you have funding to actually do your work. So that means also that by way of this relationship still being very much of a contractual relationship, you also have this bias that then gets translated to national organizations as well. Something we may want to discuss. This is obviously a very general finding. But a second very important point was that when we asked this question of how do you actually manage to have access and what kind of compromises do you make, because it's natural, and you said it at the very beginning, and it has been natural for humanitarian action since the very beginnings of this endeavor to make compromises, and principles are never absolute, and they're always about looking at one against the other and seeing what's an acceptable compromise. Now, what struck us in our findings is that there was a bit of a don't ask, don't tell policy on compromise. And this don't ask, don't tell was not just between international organizations and national organizations, but also within an organization we found that senior managers sometimes didn't really want to know what their local staff did at the front line. And that's problematic, because if you cannot talk about the kinds of compromises you're making, you can also not have a discussion on what's acceptable. And there, I feel, lies the key to working in these complex environments, is to know what kinds of compromises are acceptable. Now, obviously, it's one thing already if organizations don't get that straight, but we also consulted a lot of people living in the 4 contexts we studied. We talked to about 3,000 affected people in these contexts, and the number one complaint they had was that international actors were oftentimes only interacting with the gatekeepers. And you, one of you actually mentioned that you switched from talking to the local councils only to actually talking to the population. So that's also, from the perspective of affected people, another pointer that we really need to also question these kinds of compromises if you can only get so far in accessing the community. A third point, and you kind of alluded to that in your presentations, but I wanted to make it a bit more explicit, is this question of risk management. Because you take a lot of risks. You said yourself, you're prepared to die because these are your people and you want to help. But again, going back to this contractual relationship between international and national organizations, a lot of the complaints we got from national organizations was that that part was not sufficiently funded, that not even operational, the part where you actually manage to maintain your organization was funded enough. And I do feel all of this points to a discussion we, I think, need to have, which is an honest discussion about this relationship between the international system and the national system, and the codependencies that exist with the two systems. And obviously that's now a conversation we can have here, but I think it goes beyond, because all this grand bargain commitment to localization would mean that more funding goes directly to local organizations, but you also have a lot of interests in the existing system to still keep a lot of money on their side. So I feel that there's a discussion to be had there. Feinstein did an interesting study, Breaking the Hourglass, that starts looking at this relationship, but I think we need to go much beyond there, because otherwise we can't really understand
Hadia, thank you very much. Lots of very interesting points then. People can read your big study online, presumably, at GPPI?
Yes, it's saferesearch.org.
Good. And some key points. I mean, I'm hearing that partnership is key, and that very often partnership is not yet mature, as you have both said, and it's rather contractual. I was expecting to hear that perhaps international organizations take the oxygen out of local organizations and try and move past them and take the space. But in fact, what you're saying, the funding they give local actors tends to trap them in safer areas, government-controlled areas, so it perhaps doesn't let them be as ambitious as they could be. And the other key point I've heard you say is that in terms of strategy, there's a sort of blind eye approach in a lot of international managers about what's really being done to achieve access and things. So those are key points. Listen, we can throw it open to you all now. So please do ask questions, and let's take 2 or 3 at a time. And again, please, online, please do tweet to the hashtag Humanitarian Access with your question as well. But we'll start in the room with some questions. So please put your hand up. The rule is you have to say who you are, and you get 1 short question. No double questions or triple questions. That's great. Thank you. So any questions to start with? Who's got a question? Yes, please, 1 here. Any others while the mic gets there? 1 there. Okay, let's start. Please introduce yourself. And
good evening. My name is Joshua Neo from the Graduate Institute. I'm a PhD student and a teaching assistant. My question is focusing mainly on the other territories. You spoke about government-controlled areas. I'm interested to know what is the situation, especially with areas and territories controlled by armed non-state actors and other organized armed groups. Would you say that in such areas, local actors would be, in a sense, a better option in terms of achieving access than international actors? And generally, what would you say is the situation when it comes to accessibility in those situations? Thank you.
François. please introduce yourself and give us a question.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see some friends on the table. I'm François Gruneval from Group UAD, which is part of the family of think tank, where some of great representatives are on the floor. My question would be for Eva. You mentioned that it seemed that historically access has always been a problem, and is it more a problem now? Or, I just come from northern Mali, Tombouctou and Gao, and there people express two things, and they say, during the last war, even people like me could travel without any risk. It was difficult, there were some, but we are not at risk of being taken hostage or being killed. And now some groups are per se preventing access to international actors by threatening them to kill white men or white women when they find them. Isn't it a dramatic change in access, this new threat coming from 9/11 and the quote-unquote global war on terror? Is it something that has changed dramatically the situation? Thank you.
Thank you. One more, or should we take? Yeah, we've got one here who's going to run around with the mic. Thank you. Please say who you are.
So I'm Maria. I'm interning right now at the UNHCR. So I was wondering, in terms of the bias mentioned by Claudia, what scope do you think that there is for the UN as an organization that is steered by member states to improve in that humanitarian sense, in talking to everyone and in working also in the areas not held by the government? What is there an option for the UN to become better here, and how?
So let's take those three. So we've got the first one from Joshua, which is about non-state armed group areas. And does access, I mean, does that, whether you're with a government or an armed group, is there a difference in access for local organizations? And I'm going to pass it to you two. So Marina, start, and then Iyad.
It's very complicated to answer that question, because normally, to be fair, it's all the same. If you're going to differentiate the access on non-controlled areas and the access on the front line but controlled areas, the difficulty to access will be the same. That's the problem. During the hot phase of the military conflict, unfortunately, no one pays attention to civilians and to humanitarian access. People are too busy with war. And on one stage, it comes to the point when military people, do enjoy this process, and they forgot about access. During the pauses between those active phases, you or voluntaries or local people, together with the international, should be clever enough to find the window opportunities and just to talk to both sides and to agree, could you please give us the way and the access to that or to that settlement. That's the only way for us in Ukraine was to negotiate and to have an access to the really bad areas where nobody else could get or bring any assistance. I don't know if I answer your question, but that's my personal experience. That's it.
It's sort of the same. And what about in Syria, in your experience?
Well, basically in the Syrian context, the government-controlled area has lower risk. So basically, international organization can be able to go there, open their offices, hire their staff, and work. So basically, one of the basic issues about the contractual relationship rather than partnership is when there is no need for the local actors, basically international would prefer to go and work on their own, you know. Where basically out of the government-controlled area, basically these are conflict areas. So a lot of risks, a lot of international agencies doesn't prefer to go there by themselves, in which they'd like to go through some partners in which they have better access.
That's a very interesting point you slipped in there, that actually there's a preference by international organizations always to work on their own, and they are reluctant localizers. That's an interesting point, if that's your experience. What does the research say on the difference? I mean, what do the indicators say? Do you get more red in a government area, a non-state armed group area, or is it the same? What does, I mean, Lars Peter and then the others.
I'd like to attack it from a slightly different point of view, because I think we focus a lot on the conflict side of things. But when I hear you talking, I also started thinking, you know, in a sense, the humanitarian narrative, the way we conceive of the problem, the story we tell about a crisis. For example, the different story we tell about government and opposition-held territory is also something that constrains access, right? That's basically what you said. And so if we are faced with more and more situations where we are constrained in different ways across border or whatever, how do we then have a humanitarian narrative that is really based on the needs and that enables us at least to understand whether access is equal on both sides or not, right? And how is that narrative produced?
From your SAVE research, or does it show that there's any difference between whether you're looking for access with a non-state armed group or a government?
I mean, we had this finding that it was actually the coverage was better in government control areas in those 4 countries. Obviously, it really depends on the context, what the case is there. But one of the things related to that we also found interesting is that very few of the organizations in the international system actually feel comfortable about talking to the other side if it becomes murky. And that is when we get into territory of to what extent is us talking to an organization that is labeled terrorist, to what extent does that get us into trouble with the government counterpart, to what extent even does this get us into trouble with donors as well, who have very strict regulations on material assistance. So if we talk to one of these organizations, the question is already kind of, is that already an issue, or does it become an issue if there's aid diversion? So there's a bit of reluctance, and actually surprising reluctance in a lot of the organizations to even talk about how they negotiate with non-state armed groups.
Eva, any difference from your research for local actors, whether they're...
Well, it leads me nicely actually to the response that I wanted to give to François' question.
That was primarily about, we might call it white access. Is that what you're saying? I mean, you were largely talking about,
So my first point about that it has not fundamentally changed is, I think we're quite, we often, in a simplistic way, perhaps say, oh, it's never been as bad as now. My point was that it's a bit difficult to compare. So again, going back 30 years, or even further, there weren't a lot of organizations that were present in conflict zones. And so that humanitarian access, there was never really a golden age of humanitarian access. You go back to the Spanish Civil War, and that was an issue. Access was an issue. It was an issue 150 years ago when the ICRC came about. And so I think to differentiate, what are we comparing? But I want to nuance that, and you're right, talking about counterterrorism legislation, and the war against terror, whatever you want to call it, and it goes back to what you were saying. That has been a key and is a key issue, a key challenge for most humanitarian organizations. And there, clearly, we've had a spike since 2001, when increasingly that narrative is changing about who deserves to be assisted and who shouldn't. Should somebody from the Taliban be given medical aid, given that it's a proscribed group? So I think that narrative, clearly, that has changed, and that has, you're right, has led to a polarization where increasingly groups are seen as belonging to one or the other. And there, the formal humanitarian system as being seen belonging primarily to the West, truly or not, it's irrelevant, and other organizations that work, for example, mainly in opposition-held areas as being sympathetic to that opposition. And so it's that polarization that has indeed increased. So in a way, my point would be, it's too simple to say it's never been as bad as this. I don't think that's quite true. But there are certain indications, and certainly I would think of counterterrorism legislation and sanctions that continue to pose a key challenge to aid organizations.
Thank you. And Claudia, Maria asked you a question about the UN and UN access and things. What?
That's a very difficult one because, it goes back to talking to everyone, and the UN actors, the different organizations of the system, are basically always there at the invitation of the government as well. And with a Security Council that is unable to function really, there's also a point to be made that the UN organizations themselves are also a bit blocked in how they can actually take managerial leadership for doing the right thing. So they're also a bit blocked in in the interstate blockage that we currently see at the international level.
Thank you. We've now got some questions in from people watching online, so I'm going to sort of summarize them for you. The first one is from Fakhri Mansour from the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute, and I'm going to summarize, but he's basically saying everyone is in favor of localization now, World Humanitarian Summit, UN resolutions, SDGs, but this is going to mean job cuts for the big international UN and other organizations. With that, is the UN really willing to allow more inclusion and give more role to local actors if they're going to lose their jobs? So we might just ask that generally around the table. And then there's another one for Eva, especially targeted. This is from Rob Grace at Harvard Humanitarian Institute. Nice to hear you online, Rob. And he's asking 3, but he's not allowed 3, so he's going to get 1. And his one is, based on your research, what types of compromises are being made? So let's not just use the word compromise, let's hear what sort of things they are. So generally, first, on the job ones, I mean, Iyad, you said you feel that a lot of international organizations are reluctant localizers. Is it anything to do with their jobs?
Well, basically, this is one of the points actually discussed in our convention. We do have an annual convention in which we did have this event, and we've discussed this localization and partnership and what does it mean. And basically, to be quite fair, it has that factor into it, because INGOs would think that this is putting them out of the business, and basically this is why they're reluctant to go with the partnership. But then again, there is good examples of some of different partners, different organizations that see themselves as the mentor, as the their actual role in each crisis is to get there, build the capacity of local communities and local-based organization, and then moving forward to a different area in which to build another capacities as well. So basically, they can take that role rather than going there for the crisis, doing everything, and then pull back, and leaving nothing for the community to continue in.
Right, yeah. So there's a huge sustainability question. Rina, what's your experience of?
I do believe that the big and great institutions, they have to be upgraded because time is moving so fast. And if you would like to be competitive, you have to be flexible and you have to find the compromises. But at the same time, I do believe in partnerships. Basically what I'm saying, yes, UN is good only if it, as the big institution, understands the needs of the population and the humanitarian access. The question is, who are those providers of the analytical information? Why, for instance, in my territory, where the war is now in a semi-active phase, the priority number 1 is food, not jobs, not restoring of destroyed houses and roads, but still food. That's just the wrong data. The food was needed 2 years ago during the horrifying events, but not now. So I'm coming back to the idea of the partnership. UN, to be strong enough and confident, big institution, needs to upgrade itself. At the same time, I do believe in partnership with the local partners and more synergy between big and local institutions. And about jobs, I'm afraid to be realistic, yes, that's the case. But we're living in the real world. And it's not only UN, it's OECD and the rest organizations. It's not only.
So you do expect a real change?
It's not only me. I think it's time.
Yeah.
We are living in an absolutely different period. We're on Twitter. We're doing the politics on Twitter already. So I think that change should take place.
Good. Thank you. Eva, your compromise question. What are we talking about?
Thank you for the question, Rob. So a couple of examples. In Syria, organizations agreed, for example, in order to keep schools open, they agreed to a segregation between boys and girls and thought that was an acceptable compromise to make. Another example is to say an armed group expects humanitarian assistance to be given to a particular community But then the group negotiated that in exchange, you would also be able to give to another one where the needs weren't highest. So it's about accepting, well, we will give to one group where needs might not be the highest, but in return, we're able to give to another community, give us access to another community where the needs are high. Another compromise was about labeling programming. So often, and that's the same for international organizations, protection programs, they're the most difficult to implement, at least initially. There are a lot of armed actors, states, belligerents, they look very suspiciously at protection programs. So what you do, you go with the easier programs first, whether that's the hard assistance, whether that's food or cash assistance, to gradually then hopefully open up that space. But what we also found that there was pushback. So local organizations pushed back on armed groups influencing beneficiary lists, for example, to say, no, you cannot say who should receive aid. But also hiring staff. So there are instances, and we know them all, where a party to the conflict says, but you need to hire that particular person. So there was also pushback. So it's a bit of both. There are these compromises, these very specific examples, but they're never easy. Those decisions are never taken easily and lightly. And I think those dilemmas are faced by all of the organizations.
I've got another, thank you for that. I've got one more question I want to pick up here from John Brokovich. And he's saying, and I'm going to ask you two, and then we'll come to the researchers as well, is it possible for local groups to be truly neutral and still be largely accepted by communities? In other words, do you have to sort of take a solidarity position in the fight at some point, or can you be truly neutral? Let's start with Iyad and then Marina.
So basically, in the crisis, in the Syrian crisis and the Syrian context, being neutral means a lot of things. It doesn't mean to be on one of the sides of the conflict, whether government or opposition, but it also means to be, neutral to all beneficiaries, whether regardless of geographical, or ethnics or whatnot. So basically, to start off, if you're going to ask me in 2012, at that point it was difficult to be totally neutral. But now, after trying to reach out to the community and trying to really make them understand what neutral means, it's easier. It's easier even for the communities themselves to accept, and for the community leaders to accept the local organization that operates in different areas. So basically, to be able to operate in different areas, to reach beneficiaries of vulnerable people wherever they are, is what we aim for, is what we're trying to make the community understand, that this is our mandate. And I'd like to say that in 2017, it's really better than 2014, for example.
And Marina, in Ukraine?
Yes, I think it is possible if from the very beginning of the conflict you clearly identify your values. That's what we did. In May 2014, we identified that we're a Ukrainian organization which stayed on the territory of war in order to help civilians to survive and to overcome their difficulties, full stop. And since that, we never changed neither opinion, nothing. And you have to understand that overall people, there is no angel and devils. On the both sides are human beings. And if you confirm your position, at least for 1 year, and if they see sustainable movements towards the humanitarian access, not to the politics, not to the gaming, not to something which is not pure humanitarian stuff, they make a decision to live with you. So you're living because you provide the help, and they believe, both sides.
Good, let's come back to the house here. Let's have a couple, so we've got one question here, and one here, and one there. So we've got 3 here. So please say who you are and one question.
Hello, my name is Suzanne Muis. I work for the Lutheran World Federation. And I have a question to Claudia on risk management. As duty of care for local partners, as international actors as well, there is this moral and legal responsibility. What are international actors are doing to actually not put national actors at risk? So that's one. And what is then an acceptable level of risk that came up into the research? Also, if we talk about partnerships, where is that responsibility then?
Thank you. Was that to anyone? Was that to Claudia or Claudia? Great. Okay. Thank you. Good question. And now we're heading up here for this gentleman. Yeah.
My name is Ahmed. I'm with the mediation program at Swiss Peace. I'd like to ask the research part of the table, is there actually a quantification of how much aid is going through due to access secured by local actors? And from that, my other question is, and maybe also to Professor Slim, does that warrant a discussion perhaps on a new set of norms for humanitarian access by local actors? Does that entail, as people have spoken about compromises, does that warrant a new discussion on norms? Thank you.
There was a gentleman there, yes, just next to Joshua, who asked the first question. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Grajdas, and I work for an international actor. So I am just back from Georgia. I work for European Union monitoring mission there. And in my role, I basically, on a daily basis, I deal with humanitarian access and local actors. So I want to echo what Marina has said, and she pointed out that, for example, in Ukraine, there is a need for food. Yeah, that's true. And on a daily basis, as I have said, I listen to hundreds of NGOs, and they say different needs. And from international actor perspective, how can we get reliable data from these local actors in order to finance different projects? Because that's the biggest challenge. There is no problem in terms of funds. The problem is in a corroborated and reliable information from local actors. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are three very good questions. So the first one to Claudia from Sue at LWF about the duty of care, acceptable risk. How do we balance that? What's your research saying or your view?
We didn't quantify how much actually went to national organizations to manage their risks, but as I already said before, it's very little, even for operational costs, let alone for risk management. Probably you can say a little bit more how these contracts usually work out. We didn't look into the specifics of those contracts. We just in interviews with national actors, this was a consistent issue that they raised. That we had one example from Somalia where one national organization told us, well, listen, we actually have to dip into what the organization gives us to provide the assistance in order to even keep our salaries and manage the risks and make sure that we can pay if, for example, someone dies while on duty. And these kinds of things, and duty of care, I feel is not existent. But then again, we didn't look at it in very specifics, and it's probably interesting to see.
That's clear. Thank you for that, Claire. Let's pass it over here. So, I mean, in this idea of partnership, I mean, Marina, do you feel that your partners are investing properly in your risk management, or?
To be fair, we do not treat partners as the partners who must invest into local organization. You know, that's the very interesting division which we should verbalize during that discussion. Local organization and local people must stay in order to help their own people. They must to live there and to went through all difficulties. International institutions and organizations, they can help and come later on with the whole menu of help. But locals should be locals. That's what I would like to outline.
But do you expect an international partner, as part of that synergy, to help you invest in safety? I mean, the ICRC, for example, works very carefully and closely with national societies on a program called the Safer Access Program.
Yes, I know.
Where we train and help.
Yes, but you are doing that on the later stage, not at the very beginning of the conflict, not during the chaos, not when nobody knows what is the landscape, where and who, between the armed groups, how to cooperate.
So you're saying it's pretty impossible at the beginning?
At the beginning,
with
it is
spontaneous
impossible.
Groups arising.
It is impossible, just impossible.
Okay. So it's a second phase thing. Iyad, what do you think?
Well, basically, you know, this actually varies between different partners that we work with. Some partners took little responsibility to these aspects, and some other real partners really invested in the organizational capacity rather than anything else. So in focusing and building the risk and safety, basically safety and security department for us, given the really needed training and equipment for us to assure the safety of our staff and the understanding of the context in general, and being flexible to the security changes on the ground as well. So basically we had some good examples of partners investing in us, in building that function into our organization, but still the duty of care still is a really difficult point to reach, because basically it's really related to having the allocations for that, in which as local organization, probably most of local organization that I know of doesn't have that capacities. But international organization tries much in that, in that scenarios to help in, but it's not structured manner in that.
Just on that point, I mean, please do look at the ICRC's Safer Access program on the web, particularly if there are local organizations tuning in online, because that is a system that's been developed here between us and national societies to think really carefully how they can find mechanisms and ways to increase their acceptance, their security, and their access. So please do look in case the Safer Access program helps others. We've got Ahmed's question now about, can we in any way quantify the proportion of resources that is going through local actors? And that was for the research side of the house. Have you geeked it yet?
We can.
Upcoming research. I mean, do you think you could get close to that, Lars Peters, in terms of as you gather indicators? And I mean, can OCHA's figures help? How do I mean, it's a good point, Ahmed, because it must be a priority. If the global community is going to prioritize localization, it has to quantify it. Yeah.
So we sometimes talk about that.
Yeah.
And the way we normally do it is say, okay, so how many % do you actually think we keep as transaction costs from the formal system, and how much actually gets out? And we don't have a reliable figure, but we never have a good figure. Right? I think we're all acutely aware that that's quite a high number. Right? And it struck me when the question from the room again here about, I was thinking access is also access to the humanitarian narrative. If food is not the priority, then how was that decision made?
That's exactly. That's the question which should be dedicated to the separate conference or talk, because it is very important. The question which.
But you feel that prioritization came through international.
Yes.
Rather than local.
Oh yes, I do not feel I know that.
So with respect to Grajda's question, if I got your name right, sorry, he's saying, well, how can we know that there is reliable data from local organizations? You're saying international organizations provide endless unreliable data. But what is the answer to Grajda's questions? I mean, do you provide reliable data, you two? Can you?
Well, basically, for our organization, we do provide, reliable data. In the Syrian context, some of funds actually, like the Humanitarian Pool Fund, offers a detailed data on how the assistance will reach through international, through locals, through international, partner up with locals as well. So basically, it goes bits and pieces. The Humanitarian Pool Fund offers such a thing. I think there was a research on UN agencies as well for the Syrian context, to say how that, and we participated in that as well by offering some data. So on our basically all local organization, when partner up with INGOs, the first thing that they need to build their capacity in is how to report. Yeah, and accountability, basically. So when that is essential value of the organization, that means good reporting is there.
And did you feel that was a priority, accounting?
I don't know. I just don't know. I think that reliable data could be delivered to the decision maker only if we will create the triangle when the international partner, local partner, and independent research partner would do the proper job. And policy will be excluded from the decision-making process. If we are talking in that framework, we are successful. If we are going to sign up to I don't know, to the World Food Program in Donbass for the 4th year, where people are not hungry. They just would like to find the job, not to take the Kalashnikov. We will go round, round, around. I would be a bit more creative. If I would be the representative of the big, huge institution, I would find a great creative way of cluster, by the way, cluster which would provide me the analytical data on which I could rely on by other cluster, because double check, that's the perfect thing. If you double check things, you're just in the perfect position to evaluate risks.
Just a quick point. Okay, Claudia, reliable data.
Just quickly on that, I mean, that's one of the findings from SAFE, and also push and an invitation to national organizations to provide more reliable data, because oftentimes from the international side, it's difficult to get the whole breakdowns of what then remains within the international partner and how much then goes to the other, to the next level. And there's also, I mean, let's be honest about this, there's also interests involved in that, and it goes back to this survival instinct of where every level of this very long subcontracting chain also needs to prove their worth. And this is obviously now me talking and not so much the research, but it's a bit of the elephant in the room that we're not really talking about. But I know that you're looking into this question, so that there will be a bit more data on this.
Ahmed also asked me a particularly difficult question about, do we need new norms for access if everyone's compromising? But unfortunately for him, he doesn't know the rules, which is you can't ask the chair a question, particularly if they're really different. So that needs rather a longer intellectual discussion for it. But I think that the intent of the question is important. You know, if people are compromising all the time and we're saying that actually access is achieved through tactical negotiation rather than principle, should we be thinking about a new form? So it's a profound question, which I'm going to avoid. So we've got time for one more question in the house. Yes, please. And then please all join us upstairs after this panel for an aperitivo. So there's a lady here.
Good evening, my name is Claire Bosta. I'm working as a former anesthesiologist for Doctors Without Borders. And I feel like local and international have been addressed very differently into the separate positions, while I was under the impression that very often local and international people were the same. Like from my experience in Congo, many people who were hired first as national staff then were empowered to build on their own associations and network, and that it was not that distinct. Is it a trend or is it an exception?
Very much. Let's take the lady in front too who did want, we can take a quick one, yeah. So please say who you are.
My name is Christine, I'm a graduate student and intern here. My question is for you two. What types of communication do you need from INGOs and the UN to do your work most effectively? What frequency, what type of communication will help you best?
So, are we making a fuss about nothing? I mean, MSF is saying that actually there's no real distinction between national and international, and they're all part of the same thing. Let's just take the researchers on this one, because we're running out of time. Ava, come on, you're doing a lot of work on this.
Not on the DRC, but I mean, it's true that local staff, for example, there has been a shift in thinking where local staff, there is no longer this distinction that it's local and international. I think we're doing a better job at empowering local staff. But clearly in Syria, we have seen that local organizations haven't received the support commensurate to what they're actually providing. And so there is an issue. So no, I don't think we're making a fuss about nothing. I think we need to talk about who is best placed to respond. And I mean, MSF had issues in Syria getting access, and how do you deal with that then? How do you work with local organizations? So yes, staff is empowered, but what also happens at times is that staff or local organizations are trained, and then those staff members, they leave and are picked up actually by international organizations because they have been trained. And so there's a brain drain in a way for local organizations. So I think we would also need to look at specific context. What is it like in the DRC? But yeah.
And then Christine's question to you two as our last question. What kind of communications do you need most from, Marina, you start, what kind of communications ideally do you need from international organizations?
Yeah, you start. You're much more experienced than I.
Well, basically, in the Syrian context, we managed to really enhance and develop the communication between local organization and international organization and donors as well, UN agencies. So we do have a lot of coordination, and I say a lot because they have different, functions to them. But we do have the coordinations, forums and coordinations bodies that we attend to and communicate with the donors and partners. To begin with, and actually this is to affect one of the questions about the needs and determine the needs. At the beginning, the lack of these channels, of communication channels, resulted that the needs were not really answered, and the different priorities were set and worked on. But basically, after having those coordination platforms, in which some of which are UN led, which is the clusters, basically allow a better understanding of the needs, at least. So we started off with that. But what is really needed from international and donors is the real commitment for the partnership, rather than the communication itself.
Yes.
So basically, it really does mean a lot of things. It does really means a big change. But we need that commitment to be there, that belief in the local organization, in order for us to...
So good local action means real international commitment.
Exactly.
That's great. Listen, I'm going to end it here with just asking them each to say one big message you want to put back. And you can repeat something you've said already. One big message. So Claudia.
Honestly, let's be honest about what we're here to do. And there's the humanitarian imperative that is obviously even stronger if you're local, but there's also a lot of interest in this system that has become a business, and we need to look at those in order to understand what we're doing and what we should do.
Be honest as we develop localization. Thank you. Yeah. Lars Peters.
I would say it's around, when we think about access, not only to think about the conflict side of it, but actually also exclusion from the humanitarian narrative and decision-making and the role evidence plays in enabling local actors to do all that they can do from the space where they are.
So be really careful about narrative and evidence and what's happening. Thank you. Eva.
I would argue for complementarity, which for me means also that international organizations need to have the maturity to step back when somebody else is better placed. So not crowd out local organizations.
Complementarity. Transparency.
Transparency from the big institutions, from the big donors. Honesty and transparency, and fair partnership. That's it.
Basically, commitment to the aspired targets of localization.
Good. Commitment, that's very strong. Listen, thank you all for joining us online and in the audience, and thank you to our panel.